Some cards cost 5 Elixir and they feel like they can provide some amazing value for the cost. Others cost 7 and sure they're heavy, but when they hit the field, you feel it. But somewhere in between, something strange starts happening. Cards that should be strong just, well, aren't. They promise a lot, flashy abilities, unique mechanics, cool ideas, but somehow they never quite deliver. You invest a ton of Elixir and you're left wondering where it all went wrong. Today we're exploring the quiet struggle of Clash Royale's most awkward cost and why no matter how much potential they seem to have, 6 Elixir cards almost never feel right. When Clash Royale first launched in 2016, Elixir costs followed a simple rule. The higher the cost, the bigger the impact. A 6 Elixir card was supposed to feel like a serious commitment, a heavy, deliberate investment that could shift the entire momentum of a match if played correctly. And in the beginning, it almost lived up to that dream. Take Lightning, for example, one of the original 6-cost spells. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't stylish, but it was reliable. It targeted the 3 biggest threats on the board and deleted them instantly, no questions asked. In a slower tank-heavy meta where building up massive pushes was the norm, spending 6 Elixir to wipe out enemy musketeers, witches, or defensive buildings made perfect sense. You had the time, you had the breathing room. It was a heavy investment, sure, but it bought you control. Then there was the Giant Skeleton, another day 1 6 Elixir card, a massive walking bomb, slowly lumbering towards towers, threatening to erase anything foolish enough to stand in its way. He was clunky, awkward, and easy to kite, but the threat he created forced reactions. Players couldn't just ignore him, they had to respond or risk losing an entire side of their base in one enormous explosion. Not only that, Giant Skeleton doubled as a defensive tool. His bomb back then dealt significantly more damage, capable of wiping out entire enemy pushes if timed correctly. In those early days, 6 Elixir cards were respected. Not because they were easy to use, but because the pacing of the game gave you time to breathe, time to build, and time to invest heavy Elixir without immediately getting punished. It was a slower, grindier Clash Royale where taking your time was rewarded, and patience could genuinely pay off. But as the years went on, Clash Royale evolved. The game got faster, new cards entered the arena, cards that could generate value quickly, punish mistakes instantly, or cycle through defenses at lightning speed. Cycle decks became dominant. Cheap punish plays became sharper, more brutal. The breathing room that once allowed heavy investments to shine, that started to disappear. And suddenly cards like Giant Skeleton, originally a terrifying 6 Elixir monster, started struggling. Players realized they didn't need anything fancy to counter them. Sometimes all it took was a simple 3 Elixir Knight paired with a Princess Tower or even a few tiny guards to completely shut them down. What felt like a huge looming threat now felt clumsy, expensive, and worst of all, inefficient. The 6 Elixir price tag stayed heavy, but the payoff started feeling smaller and smaller. Supercell needed a solution. They couldn't just release more big, slow cards. The pace of the game wouldn't allow it anymore. So instead, they got creative. Enter Sparky, a slow-moving siege machine that charged up a single devastating blast, capable of deleting even the tankiest of threats. A card that could, in theory, swing an entire battle with one shot, if, and it was a big if, you could protect it long enough to actually fire. Or, look at the Goblin Giant, a tanky body carrying 2 spear goblins on its back, trying to deal chip damage while absorbing enemy fire. On paper, it sounded like a clever mix of offense and support. But in reality, it often felt like you were paying 6 Elixir for a half-strength tank whose bonus damage wasn't nearly enough to replace the raw bulk you were giving up compared to something like a giant. The pattern was becoming clear. 6 Elixir cards are no longer pure stat sticks. They couldn't just outmuscle the opposition anymore. Instead, they had to rely on gimmicks, special tricks, or clever mechanics to justify their awkward in-between cost. And sometimes the gimmick just wasn't worth the price. And the more the game evolved, the harder it became for these gimmicks to keep up. In a meta where 5-cost cards like Giant or Executioner felt simple yet efficient, and 7-cost cards like P.E.K.K.A. or Mega Knight felt like unstoppable walls, 6-cost cards were stuck in an awkward middle ground, carrying the stats of a 5-cost card but forced to pay extra for a gimmick that rarely made up for the difference. Meanwhile, 5-cost cards stayed brutally efficient, and 7-cost cards at least had the raw stats to dominate. They weren't powerful enough to match the raw impact of 7 Elixir cards, but they weren't efficient enough to compete with the straightforward strength of 5 Elixir cards. Being a 6 Elixir card is like being the middle child in a family of Clash Royale cards. You're stuck between two worlds, and neither one really embraces you. You don't quite have the efficiency of 5 Elixir cards, nor do you have the raw power or game-changing stats of 7 Elixir cards. You end up in a no man's land, often forgotten and rarely celebrated. On one side, you've got 5 Elixir cards. Now, these cards are the bread and butter of many decks because they strike a perfect balance between cost and effectiveness. Take Giant, for example. It's a fast, efficient win condition that can apply constant pressure on your opponent's towers without costing too much. It deals reliable damage and has great synergy with many spells. You don't need to overthink it. It's simple, straightforward, and effective. Cards like Fireball or Cannon also fit into this category, providing great value for their cost. These cards are consistent, providing exactly what you need without any unnecessary frills. You get value for the elixir you spend. Then on the other side, you've got 7 Elixir cards, the big boys that demand respect. These cards might cost more, but they come with stats and sometimes game-changing abilities that make the investment feel worth it. For example, P.E.K.K.A. costs 7 Elixir, but its massive hit points and devastating damage give it an undeniable presence on the battlefield. Royal Recruits cost 7 Elixir as well, and while they might not have the most incredible statistics, their shields and great control over the map make them a solid choice for controlling both defense and offense. These 7 Elixir cards may cost a bit more, but they come with abilities or stats that justify the cost. They're powerhouses that can change the course of a match. Now, here is where 6 Elixir cards start to struggle. They don't have that raw impact that 7 Elixir cards do. At 6 Elixir, you're too expensive to cycle effectively, but you're also not powerful enough to make a huge impact on the game like your 7 Elixir cousins. Let's break this down with some examples. Take Expo, for example. It costs 6 Elixir, but unlike other siege cards like Mortar, which costs 4, Expo doesn't pack the same offensive power. While it can lock onto the opponent's tower, it's vulnerable to a variety of counters, and without proper support, it often feels like a huge elixir investment that can easily be countered, which is why Expo is usually only played by really good players like Hunter. The 6 Elixir cost doesn't give you enough staying power or raw stats to make it the dominating force on the field. The Sparky sounds extremely powerful on paper, over 1,000 damage, and not just any damage, splash damage, decent health to survive a fireball, and even a lightning, though that's a huge drawback for this. See, Sparky has a 4-second hit speed, which is extremely slow, and if that wasn't enough, the Sparky is extremely vulnerable to swarm units and stuns like Zap, Electro Wizard, Electro Dragon, and Ice Spirit. The common theme with these 6 Elixir cards is that they often feel like compromises. They're not powerful enough to break through defenses or create big offensive plays, but they're also too costly to fit into decks that rely on other support cards. They sit in the middle ground, offering some utility or unique mechanics, but lacking the raw power or flexibility that defines the best cards in the game. It's not that 6 Elixir cards are inherently bad, it's just that they often feel like a weird hybrid. They don't quite match the strength of 7 Elixir cards, nor do they offer the efficiency of 5 Elixir cards. And in a game like Clash Royale, where every drop of Elixir counts, that's a massive disadvantage. Let's take a look at Goblin Giant, a card that offers a unique gimmick in the form of spear goblins riding on his back. The idea is that these spear goblins will shoot from a distance, chipping away at enemy troops or providing support for the Goblin Giant himself. Now, in theory, this seems like a great concept, a tank that not only soaks damage but also provides ranged support. However, the Goblin Giant suffers from a crucial flaw. It has less health than a regular giant, despite costing more elixir. And while the spear goblins might add a bit of damage output, they don't nearly make up for the lack of health the Goblin Giant has in comparison to the giant. It's one thing to have some extra range damage, but spear goblins aren't going to make up for the fact that your tank is getting dropped faster than a regular giant with higher health. The spear goblins don't distract or draw attention from other cards in a meaningful way either, they just deal damage, and while that's helpful, it doesn't really help Goblin Giant stay alive longer or be as efficient as a regular giant. The Goblin Giant ends up being a gimmick that is much less durable than the giant and doesn't offer the kind of consistent value you might expect. You're paying 6 elixir for a tank that's not as tanky as you want, and a ranged support unit that doesn't have the game-changing impact you need. Sparky is a card that promises a lot. When it connects, ooh boy, it can deal some massive damage with her charged shot, and her splash damage can be devastating in the right situations. However, Sparky suffers from a slow hit speed, and the fact that she can be reset by almost a handful of cards, that makes her vulnerable as well. With Logbait being a deck that seems to never die, Sparky will always have a bad time playing against this popular deck as it carries the Rocket, a hard counter to Sparky. And what makes Sparky frustrating is the high risk associated with it. The potential damage output is great, but the reliability just isn't there. You need to dedicate a lot of protection around Sparky to make sure it doesn't get interrupted, and even then, its slow attack speed means that if it doesn't make that connection, it's a wasted investment. You're paying 6 Elixir for a card that can deal huge damage, but it requires a lot of effort to protect it and keep it functioning. In most cases, Sparky ends up being a high-risk, high-reward card that doesn't consistently deliver. Compared to other 6 Elixir cards, Sparky is one of the most gimmicky. The potential damage is there, but the vulnerability makes it a serious and dangerous investment. If the opponent can disrupt Sparky even once, it loses a lot of its value, and you're left with a card that doesn't do enough for what it costs. Giant Skeleton is another card that looks good on paper. It's got solid hit points, decent damage, and the game-changing Death Bomb that can wipe out swarms or deal heavy damage to enemy towers. But once again, the gimmick makes it a lot less of a reliable choice. The biggest issue with the Giant Skeleton is that while it has decent damage and hit points, it has a massive flaw. It doesn't target buildings directly. This means that the Giant Skeleton can get distracted by enemy troops, even though its intended goal is to go straight for that tower. The Giant Skeleton doesn't have the focus of a traditional tank like the Golem or Giant. Instead, it can wander off course, chasing down a Goblin Gang or Ice Golem and completely missing its target, the tower. This distraction means that the Giant Skeleton can't always do the job you need it to do, and instead of dealing consistent damage to the enemy tower, it can often end up as a lost opportunity. And sure, the Death Bomb can deal some major damage when it goes off, but only if it actually reaches the tower in the first place. When you pay 6 Elixir for a tank, you want it to reliably target buildings, not get distracted by swarm units. The Giant Skeleton ends up being a gimmick that, while fun, doesn't quite measure up to other tanks in terms of reliability. And putting a 6 Elixir tank in your deck that isn't a win condition and doesn't have a clear role is not the way to go. In terms of these examples, the gimmicks that define these 6 Elixir cards don't necessarily add enough value to justify their higher cost. Instead of just offering solid stats and reliable damage, these cards rely on special abilities that don't always pan out. The Goblin Giant has less health than the Giant and doesn't provide enough support with its Spear Goblins to make up for that. Sparky deals huge damage, but is too vulnerable to be relied upon. And the Giant Skeleton can get distracted by troops, which prevents it from focusing on its intended target, that being the enemy tower. These gimmicks end up feeling way more like a liability than a strength. 6 Elixir cards with unique abilities often end up failing to deliver on their promises, while cards with straightforward power, like 7 Elixir cards, are often able to provide much more consistent value. Of course, not every 6 Elixir card falls into the same trap. While most of them struggle with awkward gimmicks and underwhelming stats, there are a few that manage to break free. Cards that actually justify their cost and can be game-changing when used correctly. First up is the Royal Giant. For 6 Elixir, you get a huge body that targets buildings immediately. No distractions, no fancy gimmicks, just straightforward pressure. What makes the Royal Giant strong is how simple and direct it is. Spawn him at the bridge and he's already putting immediate pressure on your opponent's tower. Over the years, Royal Giant has received enough buffs and reworks to become a solid, dependable win condition. Unlike cards that try to mix multiple roles together and end up weaker for it, Royal Giant focuses purely on tower damage. He doesn't need to survive forever, he just needs to get a few solid shots in. And that's exactly what he does. Royal Giant is proof that clarity of purpose and decent stats can still make a 6 Elixir card feel powerful without having to lean on a gimmick. Then there is the Rocket. While not building a troop, it is a 6 Elixir spell that absolutely earns its keep. In the right deck. Rocket serves as a second win condition in decks like Logbait and Expo Control, giving these decks a way to chip away at a tower even when pushing into a solid defense isn't an option. The key here is that Rocket is very specialized. It's not a jack-of-all-trades spell you can just throw into any deck. It demands a deck that is built around its strengths. In decks that can support it properly, Rocket gives you guaranteed value, whether it's deleting a key support troop, finishing off a tower, or making up for a failed push. It is expensive, yes, but when it fits, it fits perfectly. Lightning falls into a similar category. It's not universally powerful, but in the right environment, it can be a game changer. When the meta is filled with Three Musketeer-style backlines or glass cannon support troops clumped behind tanks, Lightning shines. For 6 Elixir, Lightning deletes 3 important threats while chipping a tank or tower nearby. It doesn't always generate instant value like Rocket can, but in certain matchups, especially beatdown versus beatdown, it is exactly what you need to swing the momentum in your way. Lightning isn't just a throw-it-in card, but when you need it, it can be absolutely devastating. And then there's the Boss Bandit, one of the newest additions to the 6 Elixir lineup and easily one of the strongest. Well, at least for now. With a massive charge, high health, and ridiculous pressure potential, Boss Bandit has been wreaking havoc across mid and high-level play. But the writing is on the wall. Boss Bandit is already overperforming, and it's only a matter of time before the balance team hammers it down. It's rare for a 6 Elixir card to feel this strong without glaring weaknesses, and unfortunately that usually means a nerf is inevitable. Right now, Boss Bandit is a rare example of a 6-cost card that delivers both stats and gimmick in a way that actually works, but we probably won't be able to say that for much longer. So finally, we have to give an honorable mention to the Elixir Collector, technically a 6 Elixir card, but in practice it plays such a unique role that it almost feels separate from the others. Elixir Collector isn't trying to attack, defend, or control the map directly. Instead, it's about economy. No other card in the game lets you create an Elixir advantage quite like the Collector does. It is a high-risk, high-reward building that when placed correctly can completely shift the flow of a match. There is nothing quite like it in Clash Royale. It doesn't suffer from the gimmick trap because it's not competing with other win conditions or tanks. It's a one-of-a-kind tool that lives in its own category. To sum it all up, while most 6 Elixir cards struggle to live up to their cost, a few manage to stand out through clarity, specialization, or just sheer overwhelming power. But these are the exceptions, not the rule. And their success kinda only highlights just how awkward and clunky most 6 Elixir cards really feel by comparison. As Clash Royale has evolved, so too has its pace. In the early years, beatdown reigned supreme. Slow, heavy push. I knocked over my water, and one cleanup later, slow, heavy pushes that built up behind a massive tank were the foundation of so many decks. But today, the game is faster, sharper, and much less forgiving. Cycle decks dominate the meta, and having a deck that can constantly pressure while quickly resetting is often the key to success. This shift towards speed has made it even harder for 6 Elixir cards to find a home. They cost just enough to slow your cycle, but not enough to be truly dominant like an 8 Elixir monster would be. In a world where players can cycle a Musketeer, Ice Spirit, and Cannon twice before you even get your second push going, being stuck with a clunky 6-cost card can feel like a death sentence. Next, let's talk about power creep, the natural trend where new cards get stronger, faster, or more efficient than older ones. This has only widened the gap. New cards are more specialized, have better stat lines, and are often designed for versatility. Meanwhile, many of the old 6 Elixir cards are still stuck in the past, unable to keep up with modern standards without major overhauls. One card that has managed to break out of the graveyard recently is the Goblin Giant, but not without help. For years, Goblin Giant was seen as a worse giant, offering less health in exchange for some spear goblins that honestly didn't really contribute much. They couldn't distract, they barely chipped at air units, and often just weren't worth it. However, thanks to the Goblin Giant evolution, the card has seen a massive revival. The evolved version gives him a much more meaningful presence, allowing the card to finally feel like it's worth the cost. It's a powerful example of how the game has needed to artificially enhance 6 Elixir cards just to make them compete in today's lightning-fast environment. Without evolution, Goblin Giant would probably just be gathering dust in most players' collections. Speaking of revivals, Elite Barbarians deserve a mention here. Once laughed at, they were buffed into being viable, and today they serve as a serious threat. But mostly on mid-ladder. At the highest levels of competitive play, Elite Barbarians are simply too clunky and too counterable to be a reliable win condition. Sure, they hit like trucks, but they lack the synergy, control, and consistency that top players demand. They are the ultimate mid-ladder menace, terrifying when underleveled opponents can't deal with them, but much less of a factor when everyone's cycle is tight and their defenses are polished. E-Barbs are one of the rare 6 Elixir cards that can absolutely delete towers if ignored, but they're not respected for skillful play. They're more of a brute force panic button, not a cornerstone of a careful built strategy. And then there is the Barbarian Hut. Oh, the Barbarian Hut. This card has spent almost its entire lifespan as one of the worst performing cards in the game. Expensive, slow, and incredibly awkward to use, Barbarian Hut has kinda always felt out of place. It's too slow to support fast decks, too expensive for most beatdown decks, and too weak to justify its heavy commitment in control decks. Even when Hut was briefly buffed into meta relevance years ago, it was mainly because players abused it alongside other building-heavy stalling decks, not because the card itself was particularly strong or interesting. The card just kind of exists. In a modern Clash Royale where you can't afford to waste 7 seconds and 6 Elixir just to slowly spawn some barbs, the Barbarian Hut feels like a relic of a forgotten era. It represents basically everything wrong with outdated card design. Slow startup, low immediate impact, and a heavy Elixir price that clashes with the modern tempo of the game. In short, today's Clash Royale has moved past the era where slow, clunky cards could easily dominate. Speed, flexibility, and Elixir efficiency are now king. The 6 Elixir cards that haven't adapted or haven't been rescued by evolutions or reworks are left behind, buried under the relentless speed of the modern meta. Over time, the simple formula that once made 6 Elixir cards strong started to crack. They couldn't rely on pure stats anymore, and the gimmicks they were given weren't enough to keep up. What was once a symbol of heavy investment became a symbol of awkwardness, stuck between the power of 7 Elixir monsters and the efficiency of 5 Elixir beasts. Unlike the boss bandit, of course, she's pretty stinking broken. But how broken? Is she as broken as the Royal Ghost on release, or maybe even the Goblin Machine? Well, click the video on screen to find out. You don't want to miss it, and I'll see you there.